Mark isn't here, Jordan's busy videotaping, Nancy, everyone involved is just wanting to be an audience member because they can't wait to listen intently to Justin,
Right.
who is our speaker this evening. And so, the reason Justin's here is because there's a group of us economic developers in the region who are members of GPS 4593, which you've probably seen the table in the back of the room each time they're here. It's a regional economic development group. I happen to be the chair of that group this year. Nancy Hoffman was the chair the year before. And through GPS, we are members of a group called the Community Venture Network, which Justin runs these events 3 times a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Down in West St. Paul, and they're so inspiring. And Nancy and I go to these events all the time, and each time we talk about how inspiring they are. But I'm sure Justin will talk about that sometime during his presentation tonight. But I'm going to read his bio. Sorry, I'm going to read it because I can't memorize the paragraphs of awesomeness about Justin. So, Justin Erickson, principal. He is the founder and principal of Essex Capital, a Midwest-based economic development consulting and site selection firm. For companies seeking expansion or relocation, Justin brings over 12 years of experience in helping find the right state and community, assessing labor availability, and structuring financial incentive packages. With over 12 years of project experience, Justin is able to help companies assess labor beyond simply reviewing publicly available data to verify labor availability and compare sites down to individual job categories. Additionally, far too many companies underutilize local, regional, and state incentive programs, often unsure of what's available, how programs work, or simply where to begin. And I'll second that as an economic development practitioner. There are very few people that know that we exist, and we're here to help guide all of you entrepreneurs and businesses with a bunch of free services, and then also help you find access to capital, etc. Okay, back to the bio. Essex Capital is a resource to create confidence in a strong workforce and to secure the best possible financial incentive package. Prior to founding Essex Capital, Justin worked for the Star Tribune in sales management and finance capacities and started his career in sales for Honeywell. Almost done. Justin has a BA in finance from the Carlson School of Management, University of Minnesota, and previous investment banking experience with 7, 63, 79, and 24 licenses. I don't even know what that is, so you can tell us later.
Sounds fun.
Yeah. A native of Albert Lee. Oh, I have a bunch of family in Albert Lee, Justin.
Okay.
Justin has spent his post-high school life in the metro, save a year in Kansas City while working for Honeywell. Justin's wife, Kelly, is a biomedical engineer. Wow, your family. This is so impressive. Biomedical engineer for Cardiovascular Systems Incorporated. They have been married for 8 years and live in Edina with their two boys, Ben, who is 7, and Sam, who is 4.5. Beyond work and family, Justin is an avid golfer, enjoys biking, fishing, hunting, and coaches everything his boys are starting to get involved with, which I'm assuming football, lacrosse, basketball,
We're getting
those.
Yeah, they get out of
Everything?
check.
Well, thank you for being here right before, or right at the end of the summer, right before school starts. It's busy, and thank you all for being here. And just for the first timers, I'm going to ask Jordan really quickly to give a brief history of what this group is, how it got started, and is this the 8th monthly meeting already, or is it 5th?
Fifth or sixth.
Okay.
The Inventors and Entrepreneurs Club, this whole organization idea came up. East Central Energy, Mark Nelson, if you know Mark, came up with this idea, heard a presentation out in Wisconsin Juneau County, which is the Mauston area, out on 94 on the way to Madison, they have an Inventors and Entrepreneurs Club out there. The gentleman who started it is in a county of about 26,000 people, been going for 8 or 10 years. They have about 700, 750 people on their email distribution list, and they get between 50 to 75 people each and every month. So we have a philosophy in economic development. If you steal my good idea, you've stolen twice. So we had him out here actually on Halloween Day in this room. And after that, by the time people were getting home, there was emails and texts and phone calls going back and forth. We put together a group over the winter. Kevin is on the board of that, Kevin Anderson. Trying to remember who else is in the room that's on that board. Kind of a consortium of the Regional Development Commission, GPS 4593, and East Central Energy. Our goal is to get folks together in front of speakers and presenters on different topic areas, different topic every month, trying to connect folks to ideas and resources and inspiration to try to make projects happen here in East Central Minnesota. So that's the 2-minute elevator pitch. So.
And Justin, just so you know, at the end of, or usually at the beginning or the end, we go around the room, so we know who, so you know who you're talking to, et cetera. Would you like to do that?
Let's do it at the end, because I have a request of some folks too, so if that's appropriate.
All right, thank you.
Good, you want me to take it over?
Great.
All right, I'm not going to watch my phone, but I'm going to set a timer because I tend to be a little long-winded, so I promise I will keep this brief. In the interest of wanting to open up the questions and what have you, and so the bio always sounds more impressive if you write it yourself, but I fully realize everybody has other things and maybe better things that they could be doing tonight, and so I do appreciate everybody being here. I'm going to try to keep this somewhat brief, and I don't want to make it overly formal, so if you have questions along the way, et cetera, just feel free to blurt them out. But I also take seriously and appreciate the opportunity to get in and speak with the communities that I work in and work with, and so I wanted to put together some slides and hopefully come in somewhat prepared. So we'll keep it kind of brief tonight. What I want to do is go through quickly who I am and what I do with this Community Venture Network or CBN program, give a little bit of context, because I don't expect to stand up here and dole out sage advice over the next 20, 30 minutes, but by virtue of what I've done for the past 13 years, I've seen a lot. I've worked with hundreds of communities, hundreds of businesses, hundreds of investors, et cetera, et cetera. So I've seen a little bit of the good, bad, and the ugly. Second, I want to talk about, and I was talking to Jordan and Nancy about what would be a topic that might resonate, knowing that there's some folks in here that come from working public sector capacity, some who maybe are contemplating or have started a business, some who have worked in business capacities and do currently or have owned a business for 10, 20 years. What's a topic that tends to resonate? And all things equity seems to be something folks are interested in. Then I want to touch on real quickly my belief in how folks can better utilize economic development, and then wrap up with some Q&A. So by way of background, as mentioned, I was technically born in Owatonna, but spent my 400 years in Elberley. I'll spare you the details of my adolescence, but that's relevant because I do work in and run a rural-focused economic development business. And so it was back in late 2005, I was working for a guy that had no problem tipping chairs over, slamming doors, throwing papers, and I thought, I don't really care to work in this environment anymore. And I realized I wasn't really cut from the corporate cloth, and so I thought, I'd like to get out and do something on my own. Fortunately, I had the presence of mind to realize I was probably too stupid to start a business on my own. And so I ran across these guys that were running this CBN or Community Venture Network business. They had started back in 1991. I was intrigued by it, and I gave them an unsolicited offer to buy it. And in one regard, I jokingly say, careful what you wish for in life. On the other hand, I have not had that Sunday night pit in your stomach feeling, I don't want to go to work tomorrow, feeling in 13 years. And I don't take that for granted. In part because we all need to make a living, we've got bills to pay. As mentioned, I've got 2 small children, and they cost a fortune. At the same time, I want to have something more than a paycheck. I want to have something that I have no illusions that I'm the white knight swooping into the small towns that I work with and saving the day. At the same time, I take value, and I like what I do, and I like the people that I work with. And so, in its simplest form, I've got a collection at any given time of about 30 entities. So an entity can be an individual community or county, EDC, or economic development corporation or group, to entities like GPS 4593 that I work with across the Midwest. So parts of North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. I've said that a few times if you can't tell. And so spread across 8 states. And my job in its simplest form is to find companies who are not waking up on a given Tuesday morning, for example, and no disrespect to Santee or Cambridge or Jamestown, North Dakota, or Toma, Wisconsin, or Lake Mills, Iowa, and saying, good news, we're expanding. We ought to look at some of these small towns to move a portion or expand operations into, any more than those companies that are pounding their head against the wall saying, we're on the 694 corridor, this just isn't working for us. We can't find, if we can, we can't afford, if we can, we can't retain labor, maybe we should look outside the metro. These are smaller to mid-sized companies that a lot of your usual suspects are not targeting in the sense of real estate brokers, contractors and developers, site selection firms, et cetera, because, well, I don't fault those folks. They're looking for companies that want to create 500 jobs here, build 200,000 square feet there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I also think a good many of the communities that I work with, large and small, large being communities like maybe in Ames, Iowa, Mankato, Minnesota, all the way down to Mountain Lake, Minnesota, Seward, Nebraska, are saying, you know what, we'll take 10 jobs here, 20 jobs there. That's meaningful, that moves the needle for us, and that's a misconception for a lot of the companies that I meet with that say, well, surely nobody would be interested in us because we can only bring 20 jobs or only need 20,000 square feet of space. No, that is meaningful job creation. That is something my communities are interested in. And so my job is to be the conduit, or in simpler form, the matchmaker between companies and communities. And so I do that formally through these 3 events mentioned before that we do each year, where I get all my communities together and businesses, and essentially we play matchmaker. I'd like to tell you my job is more sophisticated than that, but it really isn't. And so does that make me an expert in all things business development? Well, absolutely not. But I've worked with, again, hundreds of communities, companies, investors, et cetera. And along the way, I was also a principal at a broker-dealer firm, which is a fancy way to say that I was licensed with an investment banking firm. Does that mean that I'm some sort of Goldman Sachs investment banker? Absolutely not. Is my phone ringing off the hook by big private equity firms out of New York saying, come work for us because you're so smart? Absolutely not. But through the abuse that is SEC or Securities and Exchange Commission and FINRA oversight, the licensing, the compliance, the continuing education, coupled with working on and with a number of companies on equity raises or raising capital over the years, you do figure out a few things along the way. And so with that, I thought a topic that might resonate, knowing people are at different stages in different career paths, is touching a little bit on equity. It seems to be something that everybody kind of has an interest in if they have any tie-ins with private business. And so the first thing that I get a question on a lot is, what is equity? And some of this for folks in the room is going to be kind of one-on-one stuff, like why are you talking about this? But I also know when I approach this topic that sometimes people say, I've run a business for 10 years, I'm doing $5 million in revenue. I've never worked with investors, I don't really understand this. So I thought I would rather keep it simple and work up as opposed to take for granted that people know certain things. So the simplest way that I can explain equity is that if you already run or you want to start a business, you've got 4 ways to fund or capitalize that business. One is you can put your own money in. 2, you can walk downtown to the local lending institution, credit union, bank, etc., and get a loan from them. Now, if you are a $10 million a year business, maybe they'll give you a loan uncollateralized, or maybe we collateralize with equipment. If you're an earlier stage business, that can be more challenging. They might want personal guarantees or other terms that can I service the P&I or principal and interest payments and repayments. Now, maybe yes, maybe no. Third is you can fund it through operating cash flow. So you can say, okay, I go and sell my product and service or service for $20, I make $10, I put that $10 back into the business and away we go. And that can work too. Or fourth, you can raise equity. So the easiest way I explain it, and one of the things that frustrates me is, again, I'm no big investment banker, but there's some really smart people that work in finance. And unfortunately, sometimes they like to show how smart they are by making other people feel stupid. And I don't like that. It makes me bristle, and I think that it's unfair because I've got a lot of friends and family and others that I know that run very successful businesses that are very talented people. But if you haven't done this before, why should you be expected to know the ins and outs? So you can get fancy and talk about we're going to set up a convertible debenture note, and we're going to have a warrant kicker, and we're going to have a put option. You can get all fancy with it, but in its simplest form, and what I want to do here is keep it simple. If there's questions, we can talk about specific ways to structure deals and whatnot, is if I have a company, and I say, okay, I need some money to fuel this, and I want to raise some equity. I'm going to go to Jordan. I know Jordan's flush. He's got the mattress, money in the mattress, and so he's got plenty of money. I said, Jordan, you know what? I think I'd like you to consider investing $100,000 in my business. And Jordan says, okay, I've known you for a while, and I understand kind of what you're doing with your business. Well, what's in it for me? And I say, well, okay, I think my business is worth $1 million today. Maybe it's not because of sales or profits, but I really think we're growing and it's worth at least $1 million. And so if you give me $100,000, I'll give you 10% ownership in my business. And George said, what do I have to do for that? I said, nothing. Sit back. I'm going to use your capital. I'm going to keep you up to date on how things are going. And my hope is that over time, either we get to a stage where we're making enough money that we're making distributions where, you know what, every time we distribute to myself or any other shareholders or stockholders, that you're getting 10% of those proceeds. Or I think over time, we can get large enough that maybe somebody wants to buy us. And maybe somebody wants to buy us for $6 million. Now your $100,000 investment's worth $600,000. So it is high risk. At the same time, it has potential for high reward. So Jordan says, okay, I'll go ahead and invest. In its simplest form, that's what equity is. In terms of, I get questions on, well, what about the types of equity? And you'll hear the term PE or private equity. I'm not going to touch base or spend much time on the first two categories because they just don't come up very often in the types of projects that I see and work on. But there's in private equity, I'm happy to talk about that. There's mezzanine financing, which is kind of the in-between space between real high-risk equity and traditional bank debt. The two most common are venture capital and angel investor funds or angel investors. When it comes, and I hear this a lot, well, we need venture capital. I'm not here to argue the semantics of terms and definitions of people, but venture capital certainly does get invested in companies in the Midwest. However, these tend to be funds that are situated in places like Boston and New York and Chicago and Silicon Valley, and they've got a lot of money, $100, $200, $500 million funded through insurance companies like to fund VC funds or venture capital funds. High net worth individuals, as in billionaires, like to do this. And these are people that take very high risk, high reward investments. And so think of the next Amazon or Twitter or Uber or Google or Facebook, those types of deals that either they're going to be worth a whole boatload of money or they're going to be worth nothing and crash and burn. And these are funds that tend to put $5, $10, $20 million in a certain tranche, or they'll come in and say, we'll give you $20 million a day, and if you hit certain milestones and you're still a going concern 2 years from now, maybe we'll put another follow-on round or another $20 million into it. So it's big money and it's high risk, and in many cases, they're investing. In fact, Facebook got investment before not only did they have revenue, they didn't know how they were ever going to generate revenue. And so in many cases, this is not realistic to the types of companies that I work with. They're saying, hey, we don't need $20 million any more than we're just saying, well, we'll figure out how to make money later on. Now, for those venture capital funds, what they're looking for is they're very smart people, they move around a lot of money, but still, for every 10 deals that they invest in, 9 are probably going to go belly up, and they're going to lose all their money. So they need the one company that is a hit to really return enough to make up for the 9 losses. Again, is it unreasonable to think that VC money comes into the Midwest? Absolutely not. It just isn't that commonplace on most of the projects that I work on. Most all of the investment equity related conversation focuses on angel investors, and we'll touch on what those folks are in a minute. Then the question becomes, okay, well, what are the mechanics? So I want to start a business, I'm a smart person, I've been working in a company for 10 years, I want to get out, but I know that I need some capital to fuel this growth, but I've never done this before. And is it complex and convoluted? And it absolutely is, but it doesn't always have to be. So in its simplest form, in my mind, it breaks down to you have 2 means by which you can go out and pursue investors. So if I call Jordan and say, Jordan, I want you to put $100,000 in, Jordan's going to have some expectation that I have a sense of presenting him some information to review, not just about my company, but about how the mechanics of that investment are going to work. And so one option that gets used a lot is what's called a private placement memorandum. The acronym is PPM. Some people will call it an offering memorandum, but it's basically a predefined book of information that's put together. I've seen it be as brief as 10, 12 pages. I've seen it be well over 120 pages. I've got some friends that are attorneys at law firms and big buildings downtown Minneapolis that would gladly charge you $100,000 or more to put one of these together. I don't think that's necessary. But nonetheless, it includes requisite information. Think about it. Who are you? What's your business about? Who are the management principles involved, etc. And then it talks about some more investment-specific information. So it'll talk about unit or share price that's being established. Units refers to LLCs or limited liability companies. Shares is usually more publicly traded C-Corp companies, again, not to get into semantics. But it'll talk about, all right, we're raising money and you can invest in, put $25,000 in or invest in $25,000 increments, and that is the per unit or per share price. It'll talk about things like Are we doing a min-max offering? So are we going to say we're going to go out and raise at least $250,000 to get this company to the level that we want it to? But you know, if there's interest beyond that, we'll raise up to $500,000, and anything in between we can put to work, and we want to raise that capital. So it states those kinds of things, how much money you're going to raise. It talks about the pre-money valuation. So what do you think your company is worth today before you go out and raise this money? So with my example to Jordan, I go and say, all right, I think my company's worth $1 million today, and if you give me $100,000 pre-money, you get 10% interest. Well, if anybody can figure out the metric by which you value a small startup or non-publicly traded company, and that becomes the accepted way in which, yep, this is how everybody's going to value it, you'll become a billionaire yourself, because there is competing opinion and ideas on how do we actually value those companies. I can get into the details of how I've seen companies do it, what tends to work in some cases, if not many cases, but it's different. If your Target, last week Target came out and said, or Target's share price hit over $100 for the first time. I say, well, how do they do that? Well, there's very smart people, some of which I went to school with, they're a lot smarter than me, that sit in fancy offices that look at, okay, what's the quarterly earnings estimates that are put out for the next quarter, what about the rest of the year, what about next year, and they go out and out, and then they do a fancy discounted cash flow analysis, and they come back and say, this is what the company's worth today, divided by the number of outstanding shares, and it spits out, this is what your share price is for the company, and then based on speculation, is the company going to do better or worse? What about, is the economy going to have a recession? Is it not? And that's why you see fluctuations in stock prices. It's hard to do that if you say, well, we don't have any revenue yet. We haven't been profitable yet. So it's not just throwing darts at a dartboard, but you have to build the argument. And so that gets built in. Then what's called reasonable steps to verify, or what I call a suitability document, which basically says, is this appropriate for this investor? You don't try to take money. I'm not going to take Jordan's $100,000 with the hopes that I can flush it down the toilet on his behalf, but I need him to understand that this is at-risk investment, and I need to make sure that even though he doesn't want to lose his $100,000, is he able to do so? Does he understand, and is it appropriate based on his income levels and net worth, et cetera, to be investing in this? And so that's an important document. And then is the subscription agreement. This is basically the paperwork. You go buy a car, you go buy a house one night, you start filling out paperwork and signing things. That's what the subscription agreement is, to say, yes, here's a copy of my driver's license, I agree, I'm not a terrorist, I'm not funneling this money. Believe me, these questions get asked. And so it becomes kind of a turnkey document that you can take to investors before you go and raise capital. Well, then there's the notion of the term sheet. That's the second one that's kind of more common. And the examples I use is, let's say somebody says, you know what, I started a business 20 years ago, and we got 30 employees, we did $15 million in revenue last year, and we're doing really good. And we get approached by one of these private equity firms out of Chicago, and they want to buy our business. I'm not really ready to retire, and I like what I'm doing, but I know that there's some growth opportunities that I just don't have the capacity to tap into. And so they say, Justin, all right, we're going to offer you $10 million, and here's our proposition. We want to take control of your company. We want 51% ownership. All right. And, well, what do I get in return? Well, why don't you take $5 million of that, chips off the table. You can take some equity out of your business. We're going to take the remaining $5 million, we're going to fuel sales and marketing growth, we're going to update your software systems, we're going to do all that, but we're going to take control of your business. And I say, well, okay, why do I want to do that? And they say, because we hope in 3 to 5 years that the 49% interest that you have remaining in the business is worth more than the 100% you have today. Well, in that scenario, you're not out with this PPM looking around for investors, somebody's approaching you. Or I see this a lot where people say, you know what, I've been working for this company, I've got a product idea, or I want to get out on my own, and they talk to friends and family and other people they know that say, if you ever go out on your own, call me. I'll invest in you. I'll put in $25,000, $50,000, $100,000, whatever it is. And I said, you know what, I want to do that. So I call those 3, 5, 7 people and said, well, let's sit down and have a cup of coffee. And I start talking to them, and they say, yeah, I'm in. I believe in you. I'll invest in you. Well, you're not out with one of these PPM offerings. So the distinction that I draw is a PPM is predetermined. It's before you're going out and talking to investors. A term sheet tends to be in conjunction with investors. So you're already talking to them, and then you're going to want to figure out a lot of the same things. All right, 4 or 5 people will come together and say, we're going to put $400,000 in this thing. Well, we got to figure out what it's worth, or what do we get for it. What are the terms and conditions, et cetera, but you're doing it kind of in conjunction with investors. Now, that's somewhat of an oversimplification, but we don't want to be here all night either. So with that, I can come back and chat about that. I wanted to add a slide about crowdfunding. You'll see before, I didn't identify crowdfunding as a type of equity, if you will. I look at it more as a tool, and it's a question that comes up a lot. People say, well, what is this stuff? I want to raise some money. What is crowdfunding? The simplest way that I can explain it is 20, 30 years ago, I'm sitting in New York City, and I want to write a play. And I sit down and I write the play, and it comes out as 100 pages, and I'm thinking to myself, I've got the next Hamilton or whatever it is. I'm a big theater guy, I respect it. And I said, I can't get some theater to produce this. I need some money. So I start talking to friends and family and others and say, well, you know, when you read my play and they read it and they like it. And I said, well, we give me $500. You give me $750. And they said, fine, I don't know, what you know, I support what you're doing. What's in it for me? Well, I'll give you tickets to opening night, front row tickets. Or, you know what, give me $750. You can come one night and have drinks with the cast and crew after the show. I said, well, all right, fine, you know, it's a nice situation. Well, people got wise to the fact, especially once the internet became more commonplace and ubiquitous, and said, you know, maybe I could use this to raise some money for my business, not to hand out tchotchkes, but to actually raise money in a formal sense, and I'll give up some ownership. Well, the SEC stepped in and said, nah, Securities and Exchange Commission, you don't want to get sideways with these people. If you think the IRS or the FBI showing up on your front doorstep is a bad thing, the SEC is very much their peers. And so they said, no, you're treading on our turf. We're talking about securities. We're talking about investment. You can't do that. Well then, as an outcome of the collapse in 2008 was the Federal Jobs, JOBS Act. And one of the things that was added into the Jobs Act was how do we get more people able to start businesses and get capital flowing in smaller companies. So they said, well, maybe we could lighten up on the rules a little bit as it relates to crowdfunding and allow companies to raise money and give up ownership. And so they passed that, but as happens oftentimes, and those in economic development know this too, they come out with a new program, and maybe it has grandiose intentions and real benefit to communities and businesses and whatnot, and then there's the period of, well, what are the rules and regulations? And it takes some time, it takes some more time. And so you have these programs, you know, Kickstarter is an example of a site that's used at a federal level. And it took some time, so states started getting antsy and saying, you know what, we want to use this. We have companies that want to use this. But you guys are taking too long to put out the final regulations. If we don't want, as a company, as an investor, we don't want to do anything and find out later that, we broke an unintended consequence or otherwise, we broke the law. And so states started saying, we should be able to do this. And so I'm going to blame Sandy for this because Sandy, with her group at Region 5, and I've known Sandy for years, said, well, would you help us on some Minvest stuff? Some people have probably heard of Minvest. And I say, well, what's Minvest? How does that relate to other crowdfunding? And the short of it is, the states started saying, we should be able to do this on their own. And they said, you know what, how do we get around, not in terms of a loophole, but in terms of an exemption, how do we avoid some of the stuff that the SEC and the federal government are saying we have to wait for regulations? How do we do this at a local level or at a state level? And so they used the Rule 147, 147A exemptions called an interstate offering, or it falls under blue sky laws. If that's not a mouthful of garbage, nothing is. Here's the gist of it. Think back to some of the early ethanol and biodiesel plants. Some were wildly successful, some not so much, but a lot of them were very good at raising money. Well, the reason why they could have big public meetings and get people in and around from their co-op network and corn growers associations and whatever it may be, is they did it under the auspices of these blue sky laws, and they did a Rule 147 offering. That's a fancy way to use finance jargon to say, if your company meets 3 criteria, one, you are, in the case of Minnesota, you are filed as an operating entity in the state of Minnesota, so your license is, or your file is an LLC. Second, you are going to conduct 80% plus of your operations in your business in the state of Minnesota. And third, you're willing to only accept investors from the state of Minnesota. Then the state said, you know what, federal government, get off our turf. This is a state's rights issue. You can't touch us. And there were court battles and mediations back and forth, but that's essentially what was passed. I don't know exactly when, but we'll say a couple of decades ago at minimum. And so that's what Minvest was modeled under. Now, I'm happy to talk about crowdfunding ad nauseum because, again, I'm blaming Sandy for learning way more about this than I ever wanted to. But it was an interesting educational process. There's pros and cons to this. It is a tool. It is not the means by which, well, I'll go on one of these crowdfunding sites, federal or state level, and my problem's solved, I can raise all my money. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. A couple last things before I wrap up is, one, I get a question a lot. People say, well, I've heard this phrase accredited investors. And I'm told that I should work with accrediteds, and I don't know exactly what that means, but I'm told that that's important. And okay, The technical definition is accredited investor is somebody who individually has made at least $200,000 the last 2 years and has reasonable assurance they're going to make at least $200,000 this year, or if they're married or household income, that's $300,000, or not and, but or they have $1 million of net worth excluding their primary residence. I mean, we just can't help but make this a little bit more confusing. What that means is I have securities, or I have investments, I have cash in the bank, I have a cabin that's worth $200,000. You know what, and I've got $300,000 of equity in my primary home that I live in. Well, that $300,000 doesn't count, everything else gets totaled up. And as long as it's $1 million, or I meet the $200,000, $300,000 threshold, I'm accredited. Now, I looked earlier today, that's less than 10% of the households in the United States. And people say, well, great, so we're talking about the 1%er crowd. Well, maybe a little bit more than that, but we're certainly not talking about the 80% crowd. So I have companies say, well, why on earth? It's hard to raise money. It's hard to even find investors and get them engaged in conversation. Why would I want to limit 90% plus of the population? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's an investor protection. So it's to protect investors, and it's not always seedy fly-by-night people that are looking to bilk somebody out of $50,000, but you see situations where grandma has $150,000 in the bank and she's living off otherwise a pension and Social Security benefits, and she's saying, geez, you know what, if I invested $50,000 in this, maybe I can pay for my grandkids' college. Perhaps, but you can't afford to lose the $50,000. So part of it is investor suitability. On the other hand, and I'm just being blunt, this is how a friend of mine who's a securities attorney explains it, is he said, Justin, here's a scenario. So Jordan gave me $100,000. I did not abscond to Las Vegas and gamble it away. I made every effort possible to grow this business, and I failed. And so I go back to Jordan and I say, I got bad news. I tried really hard, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you the money back, certainly no return. And I said, okay, and Jordan says, well, I'm not happy about that. And I said, I wouldn't be either, but I'm just being upfront about it. And then Jordan says, well, you know what, no, sorry, I'm going to see you in court. So Jordan and I go to court, and I go in front of the judge as the defendant, and I plead my case and say, Judge, I did not, just spend this money away on gambling or whatever else I tried. And the judge looks at Jordan and says, Jordan, did you sign that subscription agreement, and you attested to all the risk factors and the risk disclosure agreement and whatnot? Jordan says, well, yeah, but I'm still mad. And the judge says, okay, Jordan, are you accredited? And Jordan says, yeah, well, why does that matter? And again, this is not my language, this is how my attorney friend has explained to me. So he said there is a big differentiation in the court systems. Again, not that we want to go down a negative path, that this is all lawsuits and what have you, but there's a discrepancy between one, if you're an accredited investor, unless you're going bonanza and putting in $2 million or whatnot, you probably can manage this into your overall portfolio. You can stand to lose the money, to put it bluntly, because you're either generating a lot of income or you have a lot of net worth. And second, you know what? You should have done your due diligence. You should have done your homework. If you didn't feel comfortable, A, don't invest, B, get some outside counsel, accountants, attorneys, etc. Again, is that a harsh way to put it? Yes, but I encourage every company that I've ever talked to, if at all possible, work with accredited investors. Now, there are some limitations, and I don't want to get into details. If you do one of these blue sky law offerings, there is a loosening of the rules in terms of working with accredited under a PPM offering. You can take a certain number, but if at all possible, try to work with accredited investors. I know it's a smaller audience, but it's a protection for both sides. So then it becomes a question, I'm almost done, is how do I find these folks? And I hate to be blunt about it, but they aren't looking for you. If you're a company looking to raise money, the analogy that I use is Nancy owns and runs a business, and she goes to work and works hard all day. She's an accredited investor. She's been very successful. She comes home and she feeds the kids and the grandkids and sits down, talks with her husband, does the dishes, and then sits down and fires up the laptop and goes wildly looking for deals to invest in. That is not consistent with my experience. Does it happen? It certainly can. The SEC will come out and say, know thy investor, i.e. what's your relationship with these folks? But beyond that, in my experience, and it's something that I think a lot of companies, frankly, flat out fail when they go out looking for investors, they've kind of got the blinders on and say, I only want to meet with qualified investors, accredited or otherwise. If it's not an investor, it's a waste of my time. Okay, well, I wish you luck with that. And from the standpoint of, in my experience, most investors are not out looking for deals. What they're looking for is somebody to come to them, not to say, I think you should invest in this deal, this is a hot lead, etc. They're looking for somebody, and I use the example of, most of you have probably heard of the Kevin Bacon 6 degrees of separation, is they're looking for somebody that they know, that they trust, that says, you know what, I think it's worth your time and effort to look at this. The example I use is, there's a company out in Faribault. I got to know this 4 or 5 years ago, and I like these guys. I wasn't going to convince them to expand outside of Faribault any more than I was trying to, but I liked them, and they said, well, we're raising some money. And I said, okay. So I called a friend of mine, Lee, that lives in Northfield, and I said, Lee, this kind of seems to be up your alley. And he said, I don't know. And I said, I think it's worthwhile to have a conversation. And I said, why don't you give him a call? And so he did. And he said, oh, I think I'll go down and meet with him. Now, a few things didn't happen in that scenario. I didn't call Lee and say, I got a hot deal for you, buddy. You're going to make a lot of money. I didn't tell him, I think you should invest in this company. We didn't talk about the financial merits of the company, about what level of investment they're seeing. I just said, I think it's worth your time and effort to talk to these folks. And I was on the phone last week with one of these private equity firms. They put $5 to $25 million into a given project or deal down in Chicago. And I said, well, what's your due diligence process? And they said, it's typically 6 to 12 weeks. In the first 3 to 6 weeks, or first half of the due diligence process, all we do is character due diligence on the ownership team, the leadership team, the management team. We don't care what they do, other than, yeah, it fits our industry profile. We don't review their financials, we don't do any of that. And if and only if the character references pan out, do we then go to the next step to look at financials. Again, it's just my opinion, but I feel far too companies want to race to the end game, which is meeting investors who might want to invest in the deal because of all the wonderful upside and look at my financial projections or my performance and whatnot. They've got to have a common bond, at least when you're talking about angel investors and individuals. That's just my experience. So when a company says, oh, I don't think it's worthwhile to meet with financial advisors, attorneys, accountants, bankers, economic development people, people like myself, we aren't signing up to be the gatekeepers in a formal sense, but at the end of the day, we're the ones that typically have the relationships with these investors, and you need to start there because the investors are not out looking for people otherwise. My last point is a couple thoughts on economic development, and I promise I'm done. Let's see how badly I'm abusing my time here, not too bad. Is one of my requests, not that anybody in here is owing me any favors, but if you are somebody in the community or a business owner, work for a business, if you don't have a relationship with your economic development director, I'd argue get one. And what I find far too often, I understand my job is to find companies that I can bring and expand operations into small towns. But obviously, there's a lot of companies already in the communities that I work in. And it is a two-way street. And I see this, the GPS group and most of the folks that I work with here are very proactive. That's the reason we're all here tonight. Not everybody fits that mold. So it is incumbent upon economic development directors to get out and establish relationships with the companies in their communities. Conversely, I think it's incumbent upon the businesses to also get out and know who their economic development director is. And far too often I hear businesses say, you know what, when we need to build a new building, we call them and see if we can put in a TIF or a tax increments finance district. Or if we want to buy some new equipment and we need some gap financing, we'll use the, my God, my eyesight's getting bad, but the revolving loan fund represented on the acronym, I can't read back there. And those are wholly appropriate reasons to contact economic development. But these people are also, I don't want to say take advantage of them, but they're kind of on the payroll to help you out. And that doesn't mean go to them and grouse about the fact that you think your taxes are too high on your commercial property, your home, or anywhere in between. But go to them and say, you know what, these are things that our city council is doing that is helping our business, and we want people to know this is helpful. Or these are the things that the county commissioners are proposing that aren't going to be real good for us. And they are a sounding board, if you will. They're also extremely well networked. And if they don't have the resource, believe me, most of them will go out and find it for you. I was on the phone yesterday with a guy that has a contact down in Mexico with some Mexican consulate with some avocado farmers. I mean, I run into some stuff where, who'd have thunk? And, but that stuff comes up, and that stuff is real. So if you don't have a relationship, consider these people an asset. Consider them an ally. They're my clients. I work with them every day. And most of them, I don't want to say it's a thankless job, but it is a job that can be very demanding. You're at council meetings, oh, good news, now I have a board that I have to report to too. These people wouldn't be in these jobs if they didn't care about the communities that they work and live in. So use them as a resource because they want to help you. Lastly, and it's always appropriate, right, to end a presentation on a downhill. And let's be negative. But lest you didn't think I was a big deal before, I was invited down to be the keynote speaker in Carroll, Iowa for their annual meeting back in March. And I had a couple hundred people there, and I said, what do you want me to talk about? And they said, whatever you want. And I said, that's a bad idea. And it's Thursday night at 6 o'clock, and the bar was an open bar in advance, so I thought, well, we're not going to talk about opportunity zones or tax increment financing. So I built the whole presentation around kind of the comparison, and it's somewhat of a unique vantage point I have, not only having grown up in a smaller town, but also working in smaller towns, but now, against my better judgment, living 15 minutes from downtown Minneapolis, my wife's choice, not mine. I've been told I can leave at any point, but she and the kids are staying, so I'm stuck. Yeah, but it's interesting to me how the narrative is dictated, and I'm not here to get into a political argument, that is the point, but how the narrative is dictated by people that have spent no time working or living in small towns. And it's created a little bit of a burr in my saddle. It bothers me because, and this was a specific point, if you want to look it up, there's a guy named Eduardo Porter that wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times back in February, I think it was. And at least he referenced the fact that he's never worked or lived in a small town. He owned up to that. But we're allowing people to tell us how things are bad and getting worse and whatnot. And one of the biggest challenges for me is if I can get a business into the towns that I work with, how much more it becomes real. Not just for the communities to say, hey, this is a business, they're considering coming to our town, etc., but how much more they say, wow, these people are wanting to work here, they want to live here, they're passionate about the community. I was honestly on the phone on the way up with Bob from Campervan, who was down in Salisbury, Missouri. Look it up if you haven't been there. And he said, there's not a lot going on right now in Salisbury, but he said, my God, these people really like it down here. And he said, they made me feel really welcome, etc. So in addition to connecting with your economic development director, if you haven't, my other request is, and not everybody in the room, but as we go around here, if you have something positive, and I don't care if it's about you personally, about your business, if it's business related or otherwise, but something that I wouldn't otherwise know about that's going on in Isanti or going on in Moore or Malacca or Cambridge, you get the point. I'd like to hear about that because it's amazing how the anecdotal story, I can talk all day long about economic development incentives and cost of doing business and labor. It's the anecdotal stuff that tends to get companies to say, really? We didn't think that stuff was really going on in these areas because somebody else is controlling the narrative. So with that, I hope there was some benefit. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. More interesting to me now is fire away some questions, or if you disagree with anything, I'd love that too. But thank you.
Any questions for Justin? Anybody?
So we're gonna get warm weather again yet?
Well, I was just reading the Farmer's Almanac. I got here at like 3:45, and I'm like, so I'm sitting across the street in the gravel lot, and I'm reading the Farmer's Almanac report for this winter, and it's not good. And you hope that it is just farce, because it's like, man, this is really bad. 40 below and multiple snowstorms, so hopefully warm weather in the interim, but we'll see. Jordan,
What do you see as a stumbling block? You work with a lot of different businesses. What's the first stumbling block in trying to put together a growth plan for these businesses? Is it financing? Is it management? Is it the networking, the sales? You know what I'm trying to say?
yeah, that's a really good question. Harlan, throw out your 30 seconds of what your thoughts are, and then I'll say, Harlan's dead on, and I'll steal your ideas. But what do you think? Because you do a lot of this too.
Well, thanks for suggesting I might be able to answer. I've found that the biggest difficulty is people who have deep technical expertise or a particular niche don't understand the totality of what they have to explain to investors. And too often they kind of stumble over or don't even have a grasp of the business model. And if you can't articulate the business model, how you're going to make money quickly, then you're going to really lose investors or prospective investors' attention. That's just a quick answer.
Yeah. And I want to answer your question, Jordan, as succinctly as I can, but there's not a short answer because it depends on the individual involved. You get the mad scientist type, who I can't hold a conversation with because I have no idea what they're talking about, whether it's medical device related or something in the engineering field, et cetera. And it's like, but you have to be able to articulate that in layman's where it's others, I see it, I won't name names, so I was talking to the company yesterday. The man's brilliant. He's got a PhD in chemical engineering. You don't fall backwards into that, but he's unfortunately, I think, wildly naive. It's just my opinion in terms of he's saying, well, we're going to go pursue these Fortune 100 companies and they're going to give us binding purchase orders before you produce a product. Well, I hope they do, but that isn't consistent with my experience with them. So I think it's more getting the business owner, and I would say even if you can do everything and do it well, you can't do it all at once. So find people that are willing to help you. I mean, people in economic development, people like Harlan, people like myself, more qualified people like SCORE, if anybody's heard of that. There's a lot of people out there that want to help and see businesses succeed, but they gotta be willing to take advice and feedback and not take it personal when it's different than what they're thinking about. Not a great answer, sorry. Yeah, fire away.
I mentioned, your CBN events that are 3 times a year, you had it on a slide, but could you explain, to those who never attended one, what to expect, if you go to one of those events?
Yeah.
And you have to be a member, I mean, we're members through GPS, explain how that all comes together.
Yeah, so first, set expectations low. But no, seriously, I've done this long enough to kind of figure out what works, what doesn't. And so if I get a company that says, hey, this has some appeal to us, and we hadn't maybe been actively thinking about outstate or rural areas, but this makes some sense. Well, then it becomes the logical question, where do we begin? How do we do this? Do we get in the car and start driving around? Who do we talk to? And it's not to blame economic development, but if you haven't done it before, it can get confusing really quickly. Because do I call Sandy, because I understand she's at Region 5 Development, or do I call Melissa in Staples? Well, maybe I'm supposed to call Kari or whomever indeed, and it starts, so I say, look, we can make this simple for you. If this is of appeal and you have an interest in exploring this, well, good news. I offer one-stop shopping in the sense that I've got a room of pretty motivated communities across the Midwest. My goal being not to have saturation in any given state or region, so people say, man, everybody's seeing the same projects, but have it spread out and enough of a representative sample size, if you will, so a company can come and say, we can kind of do one-stop shopping here amongst communities. And I get some companies that say, well, what do we need you for? And they don't. I mean, I'm not the gatekeeper here. Get out Google, get out your yellow pages, you can do this on your own. But I have to say, I've got communities who are motivated. You guys pay me to do this. You take the time and effort to come down to Minneapolis. Not too bad 2 weeks ago when it's 75 and sunny. But when you're white knuckling in a snowstorm cursing my name, well, you know what? That shows me that people are interested and want to be there. And so that's kind of what we do formally. And by no means was I here to solicit for what I do. But if there are folks that are engaged with economic development at the community or county level or through GPS, by all means, I probably crassly say I'm always happy to pop for the extra lunch. If somebody wants to come down and say, let's take a look at what this is. I'm also realistic that if there was a magic bullet in economic development, rural or otherwise, somebody would have figured it out by now, and I'm not it by any stretch. But I think I fit a niche, and I offer a complement to communities to kind of load the sales pipeline. My sales background, I can't help it, but load the sales pipeline around, just basically identify potential projects. And if you work it over time, you can get things done. And we just got a project done not too long ago in Elvia, Iowa. Another one is getting done in Gothenburg, Nebraska. No disrespect to those communities, but I get a lot of times people say, wow, we're outside the 7-county metro, and we're here in Isanti or Malacca or wherever it is. Can we really get companies to come in? Honestly, if I can get them to go to Seward, Nebraska and Elvia, Iowa, nothing against that. My wife's grandmother's from Elvia, Iowa, and I'm not Catholic, but their whole family is, but I've gone up many, many notches on the rung because the project that went to Elvia. But the point is, this is an area that is easy, relatively speaking, to bring companies into.
Well, and the reason I asked that question is because I wanted those here to know that there's a couple of us economic developers, I've said before, Nancy and I, who do attend these events regularly and are working to look for projects to bring them to our region. And Tom goes to a lot of those. Yeah, so I just love those.
Well, and I'll leave some cards up here because whatever capacity you're in, professionally or otherwise, if I can ever be a resource, my wife would argue it's a character flaw, but I can't help myself that, I don't know, if I think I can be of some value and some help, I'm happy to do it. I don't care who you are, give me a call. I got a call last week from a lady that I know in Southern Iowa. She's not an economic development director, but she works with a business, and she said, we need to connect with some beet farmers. Well, my mother grew up in western Minnesota, Jordan, kind of your upbringing. You remember the big beet piles and whatnot. I'm not a beet farmer. But I called some people, and apparently there is a beet farming lobbyist group. Who'd have thought? And so a couple phone calls here and there, and now they're connected with a beet farming lobbyist group out of DC, and it's just been wonderful for them. I'm not taking any credit for that. A couple phone calls and emails here and there. please, anybody in the room, if I can be a resource, let me know.
Question, of the businesses and communities you work with, and the businesses you bring there, what percentage of those need venture capital or other need equity investment versus just looking for a good place to expand?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it ebbs and flows with economic cycles, if you will. And as I tell a lot of my communities, if I could find, usually at one of these events, we'll do 8 to 10 companies, 25 to 30 a year. If I could find 8 to 10 who are saying, good news, you caught us right at the right time. We got enough lead time where we could look at a build-to-suit option or a retrofit option and facility, et cetera. So we've got the 12, 18, 24 months that we need. But we also haven't made any decisions on that, and we're well capitalized and grown, et cetera. I love those projects. And they are, I don't want to say few and far between, but they are harder to find. When I look at some of the earlier stage companies, from my mindset, if somebody is completely conceptual stage, I don't want to be blunt or rude and say they don't know what they're doing, but if it's one of that's kind of hard. But if somebody's saying, hey, we're at $500,000, $1 million of sales and whatnot, and we have some good growth prospects, but we also need a little bit of oomph behind us to grow, I'm totally okay with working with those types of companies because most often they haven't made the long-term decisions on facility, on equipment, on employees, et cetera, where there's still time to mold them, if you will. Say, well, before you go into Maple Grove, before you go into Woodbury, why don't we take a look at this? So I would say, I don't know, 50%, give or take. And a lot of times the equity, the investment portion is not going to come from the communities that I work in. It's going to be, I look at it as public incentives and financing programs are there to be used, not abused, but they're there to be used and utilized. And if you can tap into it, great. And maybe this is a little bit my jaded view, but I also look at it as a little bit of sport to get money out of like DEED and some of those organizations, because enough of it's flowing into the metro. So let's get some into the outstate areas. And again, that's my own opinion, you don't have to comment, but I would say 50-50. But a lot of times, and the example I gave of the company that went down to Elbia, what we did is said, here's what we can do for near-term facility option, some state-level incentives and financing programs, some local revolving loan funds, and they leveraged that. I don't say leverage in a negative way. They leveraged that to raise another $1.5 million that had nothing to do with any investors on the island. It was people in Minneapolis that said, show us that you're in a community that's conducive to scale your operation. So I'm seeing more and more now that, and again, I don't want to get into a political discussion, but I'm seeing a lot of companies that are, let's just say, exhausted a little bit. They're feeling like we're in the metro, we're creating jobs, we're trying, and no, we're not giggling all the way to the bank at the expense of our employees, but we're really trying here, and we're trying to keep our business, and then it's, 12% property tax increase, and what have you done for us lately? And you better bring up the, your minimum wage, and you better offer better benefits, and whether that's something that is an edict that they have to follow, or just a recommendation. I think a lot of companies are getting tired of that. They're saying, you know what, we want a little bit of a greener pasture. I'm not here to argue that because you hate Mark Dayton or now Tim Waltz, that to heck with it, and we're moving to South Dakota or outstate. I don't like to prey on that, but you do get some companies that are saying, this is getting a little exhausting here, and we can't operate profitably. And I say, oh, I might have an option for you. So, but I'm seeing more on the labor and the cost structure.
Okay, let's go around the room. If you would introduce yourself and a little bit about why you're here. And then also, as Justin asked, tell us something about your community or your business that is unique.
And not everybody has to do that. If it's just one of those guys, I'd love to tell this story.
You don't have to do that. So let's get started up here.
Good evening, I'm Tracy Peterson. I am a little micro entrepreneur. I have a pet sitting business, and I'm hoping to expand it. And I come here for inspiration and just kind of encouragement. My community, there are a lot of, I live in Pine City, and there are a lot of individuals who have really good ideas about what the community needs, but they don't necessarily have the idea of how they can make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I really wonder if it would be advantageous for us to even have like a micro loan program for people to start, even if it's going to be a part-time gig that they're going to make $10,000 a year. That would be a really nice thing to have as a micro loan program.
Mm-hmm.
So we need someone from the Pine City EDA this year.
get a computer and my business cards made. That's kind of, yeah.
There's a micro lending one, I just don't know if they go that small. I think Sandy's looked at it.
They'll go, I mean, smaller ones, but grants?
No, a grand.
A
$1,000.
grant, oh, a grant, I'm so used to always hearing the request for a grant. I apologize. Yes, I'm Sandy Boyd, I am actually now with the Women's Business Alliance.
Oh, we are, okay.
Part of the Entrepreneur Fund, which does do very small micro loans that can, I mean, $1,000 is a very small loan, but certainly would entertain and look at any of those projects that you have. All the way up to other projects that they're partnering with different economic development organizations. But I'm here to testify that when Justin says he will help anybody do whatever, he does. All you have to do is call him. And offers his support and knowledge. Work very diligently to try and put together some information regarding crowdfunding as the Invest legislation was being put in place. And I would say, if you have any questions about that, certainly just go ahead and ask Justin, because he knows it inside and out. What I want to talk about is our upcoming conference that the Women's Business Alliance is going to be putting on October 10th. There are some of these cards, and certainly you can go online and register, but it's going to be at the Northern Lights Ballroom and Banquet Center, which is just north of Princeton, just south of Malacca on Highway 169. So in this region, and with a lot of inspiring women-owned businesses, leaders to share their stories and information and interest. So please make sure to check out the website for that. And my community, I actually live in Little Falls and have for many, many years, and they have just reopened a portion of Highway 27, and the entire community has been shut down for the summer. We have had significant business closures because of that. So my piece of information is if you've got a road construction project coming on, make sure you are working to prepare your businesses. Prepare, plan, save, prepare. Because it's tough for any of you that have done that.
Oh, yeah, we saw that on Highway 8 in 2012, a lot of businesses closed down. I'm Nancy Hoffman with the Chisago County HRA EDA. We're also a small business development center, so we do work with people looking to go into businesses or businesses that are running already, and we work with business plans, assistance in finding financing, marketing, and many other business consulting activities. And I only work for Chisago County. There's others around that you'll hear from here shortly. The first thing that came to my mind as something unique in Chisago County, I don't know if it's not, Sandy probably, sees some of the same thing, but we have such a large commuting population. 76% of the people commute out of the county, Wyoming 93% commute out. And so we're actually doing a commuter survey right now of our residents so that we can find out where they're going to work, and then possibly use that as a marketing tool to say, hey, business, we have all these people that are potential employees for you. So trying to work on the labor force issue in our area and attract businesses through that.
Well, I already introduced myself at the beginning, but again, I'm Heidi with the Kanabec County EDA, and we're a new EDA. We were formed in 2015 and became active in late 2016. I'm an office of one. I do the same thing Nancy does. We're also a small business development center. I do not like being on camera, by the way, so hi. Unique. Well, first I'll say, Mora is the county seat, and the population population is about 3,600 people. The next biggest city in Canadian County is Ogilvie at about 400 people. Then it's Grafton, which is smaller. Total population of the county is 16,000 something, 15 townships. So I proudly represent Canadian County, not just Mora. I represent Ogilvie and Grafton and all the townships in the county as well. So we're here to help the entire county. What I think is unique about Canadian County is, well, two things, and probably not unique for this region, but the amount of community champions in Canadian County is astounding to me. I've worked for other communities, not counties, but small suburban communities, never seen anything like I've seen in Canadian County as far as the community involvement and the champions within the community who want to see economic development happen